Where was Abraham Lincoln born? Well, the history books we all read in school tell us Kentucky. A lot of people, including some historians, though, question whether that is true.
Every American school child learns the same tidy version of Abraham Lincoln's origins. Born in a log cabin in Kentucky, raised in poverty, self-taught, a man who rose from nothing to save a nation. It's a clean story, the kind that fits neatly into a textbook paragraph. But clean stories are usually missing something. And in Lincoln's case, what's missing is the woman who gave birth to him. His mother, Nancy Hanks, carried a secret so dangerous that Lincoln himself only spoke of it once in private, to a man he trusted with his life. And more than a century after his death, science would confirm that secret was true, while also uncovering something else buried in her bloodline that nobody was looking for and nobody expected. To understand why this mattered so much, you have to understand what it meant to be born outside of marriage in early America. There was no gentle euphemism for it. The law had a term, and it was brutal. Filius nullius, meaning child of no one. An illegitimate child had no legal father, no right to inherit property, no claim to a family name beyond whatever their mother could give them. The mother herself often paid an even steeper price. In many colonies and early states, giving birth outside of wedlock wasn't just shameful, it was a criminal offense. Women were hauled before courts, fined, sometimes whipped, sometimes locked away. The child's existence was treated as evidence of the mother's crime. And the stigma didn't fade once the legal punishment ended. It followed families for generations, whispered about in small communities, weaponized by political rivals, hidden behind invented stories about dead husbands or distant cousins who were really something else entirely. This was the world Lincoln's mother was born into. Nancy Hanks came into the world around 1784 in the rugged backcountry of what was then Western Virginia. Record-keeping on the frontier was sparse at best. There were no hospitals, few churches with reliable registries, and families that moved from settlement to settlement chasing land and opportunity. What survives from that era is fragmentary. A court document here, a family Bible entry there. Decades-old recollections gathered long after the fact. From these fragments, a difficult picture emerges. Nancy's mother, a young woman named Lucy Hanks, appears to have given birth to her without ever having married. Lucy would later marry a man named Henry Sparrow, but not until years after Nancy and her sister were born. Nancy grew up carrying her mother's maiden name rather than a father's, which in that era was itself a quiet public confession of her origins to anyone who understood the custom. Lincoln knew all of this. He didn't learn about it as some abstract historical curiosity. He carried it as a private wound throughout his adult life. Sometime around 1850, while riding in a horse-drawn buggy toward a courthouse in Illinois with his law partner and eventual biographer, William Herndon, Lincoln broke his silence. According to Herndon's own account, Lincoln told him to keep what he was about to say a secret for as long as he lived, and then said that his mother had been born illegitimate, the daughter of what he believed was a well-born Virginia man whose identity had never been recorded. He then added a line that has echoed through history ever since, that everything he was, or ever hoped to be, he owed to her. Sit with that for a moment. This was a man who would go on to hold together a fractured nation, end a system of human bondage that had lasted over 2 centuries, and deliver some of the most quoted words in the English language. And he was carrying privately the knowledge that if his political enemies ever learned the full truth about his mother's birth, they would use it against him without hesitation. In the political culture of the 1800s, illegitimacy wasn't just personal gossip. It was ammunition. It could be used to question a man's character, his fitness for office, his very right to a public life. Lincoln understood the risk well enough to swear his closest confidant to silence. Herndon kept that promise for decades. But Lincoln didn't live to see old age. He was assassinated in 1865. In 1889, more than 2 decades after Lincoln's death, Herndon finally published his biography of the president, and he chose not to leave out what Lincoln had told him in that buggy. He believed the truth mattered, even an uncomfortable one, and he had spent years gathering testimony from everyone who had known Lincoln personally in an effort to present the man rather than a myth. The reaction was fierce. Members of the Lincoln family were furious. Lincoln's surviving son, Robert Todd Lincoln, spent much of his life trying to protect and control his father's public image, and he deeply resented what Herndon had revealed. Critics called Herndon bitter, unreliable, even a liar motivated by old grudges. But here's the part that makes this more than just one man's word against a grieving family's wishes. There was documentary evidence, and it had been sitting quietly in a county courthouse in Kentucky the entire time. Buried in the archives of Mercer County was a grand jury record from November of 1789, showing that a woman named Lucy Hanks had been formally charged with the crime of fornication. At that time and in that place, such a charge meant one specific thing. An unmarried woman had given birth. The existence of her child was, quite literally, treated as evidence against her. The timeline lined up disturbingly well. If Nancy was born around 1784 and her sister a few years later, both children would have arrived well before Lucy's eventual marriage to Henry Sparrow. And remarkably, just months after that indictment was filed, a note survives in Lucy's own handwriting, giving her consent to marry Sparrow. Weeks after the wedding, the fornication charge against her was quietly dropped. Marriage, in the eyes of the court, had restored her respectability. Nancy, meanwhile, kept the Hanks name for the rest of her life, a lasting mark of the circumstances of her birth. For more than 100 years afterward, historians argued bitterly over what all of this really meant. Some sided firmly with Herndon, convinced that Nancy Hanks had indeed been born illegitimate. Others pushed back hard, insisting Lucy Hanks had actually been a widow with a different surname, and that the entire illegitimacy story was a fabrication invented to smear Lincoln's memory. Careers were built and spent arguing over faded court records and second-hand recollections, and neither camp could produce anything close to definitive proof. The written record from the American frontier in the late 1700s was simply too thin to settle the matter. What the debate needed was something historians in the 19th and even most of the 20th century didn't have access to: a way to read the evidence written directly into human cells. That tool finally arrived in the form of mitochondrial DNA testing. Unlike most of our genetic material, mitochondrial DNA passes down almost unchanged from mother to child, generation after generation, along an unbroken maternal line. It doesn't mix with a father's genetic contribution the way nuclear DNA does. This means a woman living today can carry virtually the same mitochondrial signature as a female ancestor who lived hundreds of years earlier, as long as the line of mothers and daughters was never broken. In 2015, a team of genetic genealogists who had spent years, in some cases decades, studying the Hanks family tree decided to put the century-old feud to a scientific test. Lincoln himself left no living descendants. His family line ended with a grandson who died childless in the 1980s. But mitochondrial DNA doesn't require Lincoln's own descendants. It only requires descendants of the women in his maternal line, meaning the daughters and granddaughters of Lucy Hanks and her relatives, wherever they could be found. Researchers tracked down two separate groups of living women. One group descended, through an unbroken chain of mothers and daughters, from Lucy Hanks's own mother. The other group descended from women that rival historians claimed were actually Lucy's true sisters under a different, more respectable family history. If the more scandalous version of events was correct, the first group should all share an identical, distinctive mitochondrial signature, while the second group, tied to a completely separate family, should not. The testing was carried out at a genetics lab, and the results were released to coincide with an anniversary of Lincoln's death. What they found ended the argument instantly. Every woman in the first group carried an identical, rare mitochondrial haplogroup. Every woman in the second group carried a completely different, far more common European lineage. There was no overlap between the two family lines at any point in recorded or unrecorded history. The alternate, more flattering version of Lucy Hanks's story collapsed under the genetic evidence. Herndon had been telling the truth all along. But that wasn't the only thing the testing revealed. The specific haplogroup shared by every descendant of Lucy Hanks's line turned out to be something researchers weren't expecting to see at all in a family with deep roots in colonial Virginia. It belonged to a rare subgroup of haplogroup X, a lineage that traces back roughly 20,000 years to populations concentrated not in the British Isles or Western Europe, but in North Africa, the Horn of Africa, and the Near East, particularly around the Mediterranean basin. Most Americans with colonial ancestry carry far more common maternal lineages tied to Britain, Ireland, or Germany. Finding this specific rare marker in a frontier Appalachian family was unusual enough that the researchers double-checked their results before publishing them. It didn't point to anything recent or scandalous about Nancy Hanks's actual father. What it pointed to was something much older and much bigger. A reminder that the neat, tidy myth of pure, unmixed European bloodlines among America's earliest colonial families was never entirely accurate to begin with. Human migration, mixing, and movement across regions and centuries left traces in family trees that nobody in the 18th or 19th century could have possibly known about, and that many people today still don't expect to find sitting quietly in their own ancestry. Strip away the science for a moment and look at the human story underneath it. Lucy Hanks was a young woman on the American frontier who became pregnant outside of marriage, for reasons history will never fully recover, and paid for it with a criminal indictment and public shame. Her daughter Nancy grew up carrying that stigma in her very name, raised largely by relatives, fully aware of what society thought of children like her. She married a man who couldn't write his own signature, lived in a one-room cabin, and died of a preventable frontier illness when her son was only 9 years old. That son went on to preserve a fractured union, end slavery in the United States, and write some of the most enduring words in American political history, all while privately carrying the knowledge that a single piece of buried courthouse paperwork could have been used to try to destroy him. The DNA results released in 2015 didn't create a scandal. They confirmed a truth that Lincoln himself had already confessed, quietly, to one trusted friend more than a century and a half earlier. They also stripped away a comfortable myth about pure, simple colonial ancestry that America had told itself for generations. What the evidence ultimately reveals isn't really about a rare genetic marker at all. It's about a legal and social system that criminalized women for the circumstances of their children's birth, that branded those children as legally non-existent, and that forced families into decades of silence out of fear and shame. It's about a man who inherited none of the advantages that systems supposedly required for greatness, and who rose above it anyway. Lincoln believed his best qualities came from his mother. The evidence never confirmed the identity of the man who fathered Nancy Hanks, and it probably never will. But it confirmed something Lincoln already knew in his bones, that where you come from doesn't determine what you become, and that the secret he spent his whole life protecting was never something to be ashamed of at all.